Good morning and welcome to WADK. We are delighted to have Bill Brands, very famous historian, H.W. Brands. And believe me, if you haven't heard him or listened to him, go to the internet. There are dozens of lectures. He's inspiring, he's educational, he's fun, he makes history interesting. And so we are delighted to have Dr. Brands with us today. He was born in Oregon. He went to college in California. He sold cutlery around the American West. He has graduate degrees in both mathematics, which is interesting to me, and history from Oregon and Texas, and now is teaching at Texas A&M. The University of Texas,
right,
but has taught at Vanderbilt and at Texas A&M.
Right.
And he is the chair of the Jack S. Blanton Sr. Chair in History at the University of Texas in Austin. He has to his name 30 books, which is incredible. History and politics, 2 of them, Traitor to his class, and The First American were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. And they've been translated in all sorts of languages. He is a consummate storyteller, as you're going to hear in a moment. And we are so glad to have you with us today. And on top of everything else, he publishes historical poetry. So if you're interested in following him on Twitter, you can do so at HW Brands. So thank you very much. We're going to be talking a lot about a book that Bill wrote called American Colossus. I hope you can see that. Yeah, it's the Triumph of Capitalism, 1865 to 1900, follows the 30 years after the Civil War, when this country changed phenomenally in many, many ways. And I think Bill is going to tell us how and why. So let's start out and first answer the question about whether or not you have been to Newport, because Newport is, in our view, the center of the Gilded Age.
Yes, and I feel actually remiss in saying that I've not had a chance to visit Newport.
We'll have to get you here.
Yes. Yes.
So what do you know about Bill? I mean, you have to know a lot about Newport because you're a tremendous researcher and historian, but what's your impression from afar of this little teeny city? Julian Fellows calls it a village of palaces, which I think is so beautiful because I think he's right.
Well, I think it was a center of some of the competitive house building that marked the Gilded Age. People had all sorts of money and they had to figure out how to let folks know what they had. In an earlier time, people would have purchased other things. They might have, in other countries, they would have purchased titles and they would have become courtiers and that sort of thing. In the United States, money could pile up in banks, but that wasn't very impressive. And one of the reasons that people make money is to show the world how successful they are. And in the era starting really around the end of the Civil War to the beginning of the 20th century and even beyond, one of the ways these people did it, one of the ways the tycoons and even the lesser wealthy would show off was to build big houses. Many of them built big houses in New York. And so Murray Hill, where J.P. Morgan had his house and the Vanderbilt had houses, but there was also the place where you wanted to get out of the city and where you could relax and let your hair down, so to speak. And Newport was one of those places. And so once people start building and other people come and they start building, and eventually, I mean, the same sort of thing goes on in the Hamptons today and goes on in Malibu and Hawaii and every other place. There is something about, it's like the plumage on the peacock, if you've got it, you want to flaunt it.
Oh, you are absolutely right. And that is Newport. And I think that's why we love Newport so much. There are so many questions that I can ask. There's a lot of debate about when the Gilded Age began, when it ended. What are your thinkings, Bill?
Well, the Gilded Age sort of began when Mark Twain and Charles Warren wrote a book by that title. I mean, the age itself is usually accounted by historians to start around the end of the Civil War and go till about the beginning of the 20th century. But that's imprecise. I should say, speciously precise. And it starts in 1865 because before then, historians are focused on the Civil War. And around 1900, then you enter a more recognizably modern era. But it's generally thought to be the final third of the 19th century. And it's a time when American energies focused on the private sector, on building up businesses in a way that they had not before, and in a way that was ameliorated later. So it's after the sectional crisis and the Civil War, and it's before the beginning of the progressive era of the early 20th century. So in some ways, it's defined by default. But that period from 1865 to 1900 captures the moment when American capitalism really came into its own. In 1865, the United States was capitalist in form, but the consequences of what embracing this capitalist revolution meant had yet to play out. By 1900, they were fully evident. And this is what gave rise to the progressive era, because progressivism was very much about reining in this capitalism that had grown so powerful in this relatively short period of time.
Yeah, we're pushing it back is what was, or
Yeah.
the attempt was to try to push it back.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the ways I talk about this is I explain that what characterizes the United States as a country, as a political system, as an entity, are the two institutions of democracy and capitalism. And democracy developed in America, not from the very beginning. And at the time of the American Revolution, almost nobody believed in democracy. But in the first half of the 19th century, the idea that ordinary people should actually exercise political power took hold. And so democracy, at least as an idea, as a theory, was in place by about 1850, certainly by the beginning of the Civil War. Capitalism was a little bit slower to take hold. Again, capitalism characterized by private property and market interactions. It was emerging slowly. There were factories, there of course were businesses in the first half of the 19th century, but it really kicks into high gear during the Civil War, in large part because of the government's spending on the war. But in the second half of the 19th century, which is really from 1865 to about 1900, capitalism really comes into its own. And there emerges this tension between democracy and capitalism. Democracy is characterized by equality as a fundamental value. When we go to vote, each one of us has just a single vote, whether we're rich or poor. Capitalism is characterized by inequality. In fact, inequality is the engine that makes capitalism work. If I'm better at this than something else, I go to choose that and I get paid more to do it. The people who are really good at certain things get paid whatever the market will bear. And capitalism aggravates inequality because people who are really good at making money make a lot of money. They make more money, they become wealthier. And for most Americans, that's fine. I mean, the idea inequality per se has not been a real problem for most Americans, but when inequality reaches beyond a certain point, then people get worried that economic inequality, the inequality of capitalism, will undermine the equality that democracy requires. And that's exactly what happened starting in the 1890s. The progressives said capitalism is basically getting too big for its britches and it's undermining democracy. So democracy has to step in. I call the period from 1865 to 1900 the era of the capitalist revolution in America. The period that begins about 1900 with 1901, when Theodore Roosevelt becomes president, is the progressive era, which I call the democratic counter-revolution.
When you talk about, to me, this whole era from the Civil War up to 1900 is an extremely exciting one in this country because incredible change was occurring, driven by incredible wealth. One of the things we've been struggling with here at the Preservation Society of Newport County is the fact that this particular era of history, of American history, seems to be not well appreciated, misunderstood, not even known about, actually. I think the TV show, The Gilded Age, is elevating it somewhat, but most Americans don't know very much about who were the presidents in 1880. What was going on, where railroads, business, enterprise, everything. Why do you think that we have seemed to left out the Gilded Age from our stories?
Well, I wrote a book about it, so I'm trying to remedy this.
I know, that's why we love you.
Right. But I'll go beyond by saying this, that because we are democracy, we tend to focus on events that take place in the public sphere, in the sphere of politics. And so much of American history is defined by politics, the American Revolution, the writing of the Constitution, the sectional crisis between the states, the Civil War, the World Wars, and all of this. The big story of the Gilded Age occurs in the private sector. That doesn't mean it occurs out of sight, but it's sort of out of the public mind. It's out of the public business. And during the Gilded Age, what private corporations did, that is, privately owned corporations did, was by law, no business of the American people. So there was nothing like the SEC and its requirements for publicly traded companies to open their books. Companies didn't have to open their books in those days, and they didn't. And so the only way people knew that John D. Rockefeller was really rich, or that the Vanderbilt family was really rich, other people were really rich, was by, well, the big houses that they built. Because otherwise, and America, even as it was getting this class of very wealthy people, still maintained this idea that people were basically the same. So J.P. Morgan, the most powerful banker in the United States, John Rockefeller, the wealthiest man in the United States, Andrew Carnegie, the great steel magnate, they dressed like everybody else. They didn't wear special uniforms. They went around in carriages like other people did. Now, people like Morgan would have their own private rail cars, but they still, traveled by train. And so in outward appearances, if you saw J.P. Morgan on the street, he wouldn't have looked any different than anybody else.
Very democratic.
Precisely, democratic in appearance. And so the big stories that are going on are stories that have to be inferred, unlike the stories of politics. So when we elect presidents, when we have a civil war, it's played out on the front pages of the newspapers. One of the interesting things about newspapers of the Gilded Age is the extent to which they did try to report on some of the financial, speculations and shenanigans that were going on. But in large part because a lot of that stuff was supposed to be kept secret, they had a hard time. So the Gilded Age is a little bit like this, one of those images that are created by the negative things around it. There's the Civil War before this, and then there's the 20th century with its world wars after it. And then the Gilded Age is in the middle. And the stuff that we're trying to look at, we can't see very well. We can just get images of it, visions of it. It sort of flits across the screen now and then. You mentioned that nobody knows the presidents of the Gilded Age. Now, that's not the fault of the Gilded Age exactly. It's the fault of the writers of the Constitution. Because when they wrote the Constitution in 1787, they intended that the American federal government would be driven primarily by the legislative branch. The members of Congress, these were the real players. And most presidents of the 19th century, not just the Gilded Age, but the first half of the 19th century as well, were pretty unmemorable. And they were unmemorable by design, because presidents weren't supposed to be a big deal. They were just the chief executive officer, and they were executing the will of Congress. Now, things changed in the 20th century when the United States acquired a full-time foreign policy. But if folks can't remember, Benjamin Harrison, or was it William Henry Harrison, Grover Cleveland, which time was he president, once or twice? Rutherford B. Hayes, for heaven's sakes, So it's not surprising that people can't remember, because presidents during that era didn't do much. They weren't supposed to do much, and not much was expected of them.
Now, would you do, I know that you do this in your writings, connect those characters, the Berwins, the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, to some of the characters today who I think represent a second Gilded Age? And are the connections strong, or are the similarities pretty weak? I think I know the answer.
There are similarities in function. And so there are individuals who, at a given moment in the evolution of American capitalism, see opportunities and they take advantage of those opportunities. And so, for example, John Rockefeller became the master of the oil industry because he was really good at the technology of refining oil, but he was also really good at the business side of things. And you could look at somebody like Jeff Bezos today, who figured out that the internet allowed people to buy originally books online. You didn't have to go to a bookstore. You didn't have to live in a city that had a bookstore. And once the idea caught on with books, then he extrapolated into other fields. And so one of the reasons that a John Rockefeller and a Jeff Bezos get attention when they do, and it's very often negative attention. People like Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan's a good example from the Gilded Age. They really felt put upon. They felt that they were not appreciated. And they were not appreciated because the things that they did, especially in Rockefeller's case, were quite mundane. His principal product was a 2-gallon tin of kerosene that people used to light their homes. Now, this was a revolution in the way people actually lived, because before this, only the rich folks could stay up after dark. Lighting was, well, candles, they kind of flicker and they smell, or if you could get whale oil lamps, well, whale oil is pretty expensive, but kerosene, it basically democratized the night. So people could stay up after dark. Well, that's just it's a small thing. It's not like saving the Union like Abraham Lincoln, but it's a really big deal if multiplied by the millions and millions of people who take advantage. Likewise with Jeff Bezos. Bezos, the people who subscribe to Amazon Prime, who buy through Amazon, it improves their lives a little bit, but accumulatively, they make Bezos very wealthy. And when people like Rockefeller, when Bezos reach a certain degree of wealth, and with the wealth comes, it's not exactly power. It's not like the power of a president or an elected official to put you in jail if you disobey. Jeff Bezos can't put you in jail if you decide to withdraw from Amazon Prime. And John Rockefeller couldn't put you in jail if you didn't buy his kerosene. But they have this influence that strikes other people eventually. And members of Congress, for example, cannot resist the temptation to point fingers of blame at these powerful people because they put a face. The real point of all this is individuals like that put a face on these developments that are otherwise really hard to pin down. Because what people complained about in the 1890s was the consolidation of industry, the growth of the institutions of capitalism. Well, when put in those terms, what can you get your hands around? Where can you point the finger? But if you point at John D. Rockefeller, he's the guy. Likewise, what people don't like about the internet, they can say, well, blame Jeff Bezos or blame Mark Zuckerberg or blame whoever it is. The heroes / villains of the age are there because they serve this emotional and political purpose for those people who want to make a case against much broader developments.
It's going back to something you said before about the focus on government now is how we understand our country. And the focus in the 80s and 90s, 1880s and 90s was all hidden. It reminds me of the fact that when we are doing our research, Bill, we're trying to understand how did the breakers get built? How did it get built in less than 24 months? It's 70 rooms and the ornateness of it is incredible. And interestingly, the Vanderbilt family didn't allow any articles to be written about the house, about the building of the house. It was blocked off from view. We don't know anything about how many people were working on the site. Where were they eating? What were they eating? What were they being paid? How did this happen? And so when we tell our stories about these magnificent houses, we are hampered because we haven't found the box of letters, the diary that will tell the real story behind the creation of the breakers, the elms, Marble House. It is so frustrating. And I guess it will be like that maybe forever, unless somebody comes along saying, I've got this thing in my attic and maybe you'd be interested.
Well,
it's really interesting in terms of being a researcher. You're a historian, that we are hampered by this period to a degree because of the confidentiality.
So with no disrespect, Trudy, the reason you don't know this stuff is because the Vanderbilts and their ilk thought it was no damn business of yours.
Exactly.
And it wasn't. By law, it wasn't. And for historians like me, I can tell you from personal experience, it is a whole lot easier to study any branch of government, whether it's the US government, state government, than it is to study any corporation, because corporations do not have to open their records to me. The government does have to open its records to me because those are public records. And so this is one of the reasons why there's this imbalance between what we know about government and political figures and what we know or don't know about private corporations and private individuals. Of course, it was also a time before social media and everybody having a camera in his or her pocket or purse. So it would be very interesting to know how the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and all the others would have fared in a day of when everybody had eyes, everybody was recording everything.
Right. Well, when you look at those families, whether it's Astor, Vanderbilt, whomever, what is your gut reaction to Cornelius Vanderbilt, William Vanderbilt? Do you have a point of view about these men and their wives, Alva, and all of them? I mean, they are pretty interesting characters. We know gossip about them, but tell us what you know.
I mean, what I will say generally is that the founders of the great fortunes were almost always very talented individuals. Now, they had, in many cases, rough aspects of their personality. Cornelius Vanderbilt was a brawler, and one of the reasons he won control of the transport industry in New York Harbor and then the railroad industry was, in some cases, he would quite physically beat up on his competitors. But nonetheless, he had a knack for organization, for motivation. He had an eye for good investments. And so whether you like what they wound up producing or not, one has to have a certain respect for the talent and the ability of those people at that particular time to succeed in those circumstances. It's almost like watching a great ballerina or an excellent basketball player. You just have to respect the talent and acknowledge that not many people have this kind of talent. So there's that part of it. When you get to the second generation, the people who inherit the wealth, to me, without getting into particulars, it's very often the story of, so, it's sometimes said that, power corrupts. Well, great wealth brings out both the virtues and the flaws in individuals, because these are people who very often don't have to work for a living. And so they can either do great things, or they can squander the money, or they can just idle their time away. And I mean, as I say, sometimes it brings out the best. Theodore Roosevelt was an heir to a family fortune, not at all on the scale of Vanderbilt's, but whereas Roosevelt's siblings and cousins often decided they would just live a genteel life, Roosevelt decided that he wanted to get into things. He joined what he called the governing class. In fact, he was impatient. He could have circulated with the Vanderbilts and the Astors and all their crowd, but he didn't want to. He wanted to get in and mix it up with William Tweed and Tammany Hall, because as he put it, he wanted to be part of the governing class, not part of the leisure class. And so in his case, he chose the path that was more arduous. Of course, Theodore Roosevelt was one who always chose the most arduous path. But in his case, the wealth that he inherited freed him up to accomplish much of what he accomplished. And so in second and third generations, very often you would see a kind of noblesse oblige come out. And in Theodore Roosevelt's case, he took the example of his father. His father, in fact, was wealthier than he was because the family fortune got divided up as generations passed. But his father devoted his life to philanthropy. And this at an age before there was anything like public welfare relief systems. And so when if poor people were not going to suffer, if they were going to get any kind of help, it would come through the private sector, through people like Theodore Roosevelt Sr. and other wealthy individuals. And this very often included the wives of the wealthy folks, because they would, they had all these resources now. What are you going to do with them? And in some ways, the wives of the wealthy folks in those days were a bit like first ladies of the United States, in that the first ladies, and until now, the spouses have always been women, because we haven't had a woman president yet, but they usually felt incumbent upon them to engage in some kind of worthy endeavor. Nobody had elected them to anything, but still they could set a model, they could set an example. And in the case of the wives in the Vanderbilt and Astor clans and all those, they also had resources. So they could, if they found something worthwhile to do with their time and with their resources, they could have a great positive impact on their communities. So I would say that if you look at the wealthy families, they're sort of like all other families, except the traits are magnified. The wealth allows everything to be magnified. The faults, they become magnified. The virtues become magnified as well.
Well, and a lot of those women, they could be CEOs today. They were running, you think of somebody like Alice Vanderbilt or Alva Vanderbilt, not only helping create Marble House and the Breakers, working closely with the architect, but then running the day-to-day operations of this vast house with all of the activities that were going on, and then entering in the case of Alva, entering into the realm of politics by becoming a suffragette and putting her money into the cause, going out on the road, giving speeches, writing plays. She was a pretty, whether you like her or not, and she's a pretty tough woman, she was pretty impressive in her abilities. She could today be running a big company, I think, is what I'm trying to say.
Yes, I agree. And in fact, that is in a long-standing American tradition as well. So American farm families were always partnerships. And there was a division of labor. So the men were typically the ones who got behind the teams and plowed the fields, but women tended the gardens. They often tended the finances. So women on farms were fully equal partners to their husbands. And in the case of sort of the capitalist sphere as just the business sphere, that wasn't very often the case. But with the activities you just described, if you take the family contribution to society, it was a package deal. It was a partnership.
And then on top of everything else, you had to play the social game of getting invited to the right parties and advancing up that ladder to be number one. All of that competition, that takes a lot of energy and a lot of political strategy, don't you think?
Well, it certainly does. And in some ways it was harder than in the political sphere because you didn't always know what the rules were. And one of the great things about democracy is that there is this final test. It's called a vote. And who gets the most votes wins. But when you're in the realm of social expectations, the votes never quite get counted. And some votes count more than others. And you don't always know ahead of time whose votes count the most.
Right. So, one of the things that I'd love to hear you talk more about, again, this is a failing on our research, the whole working class of that period, for us trying to understand the different communities and populations of people coming into Newport and doing all sorts of jobs, trying to put a story together about the people who worked in our houses, very hard to do. Again, I don't know if we're ever going to really have that story down as well as I'd like, but do you have any advice? What was the temperament of people? What were they thinking about? Were they angry at the people that they were working for, or grateful that they had a job? What was going on?
Well, I will agree that ordinary people during ordinary times are the hardest folks to write about in history, because ordinary people then, indeed even now, they don't keep records of their lives. And especially for people who didn't travel, and working class and poor people didn't travel a lot. So they tended not to write letters to their loved ones. We historians benefit from letters. And a good example of this is the relationship between John Adams and Abigail Adams, the founding couple of American history. And one of the reasons we historians can tell so much about the lives of the two and the relationship between them is that they spent most of their adult lives apart, because Adams was off in Europe as a diplomat, or he was in Philadelphia and Abigail was back in Quincy or Braintree, and they would write letters back and forth. But the time of their married life that was probably happiest for them was the time that becomes invisible to the historians, when they're actually together, because when they're together, of course, they were not writing letters to each other. So it's really hard to get a hold of people like that. You ask the question, how did these ordinary folks feel? Well, the first thing I'll say is, because there were lots of them and they were all individuals, they felt various ways. One measure of their feeling about all this is the fact that the Gilded Age was the period of the highest immigration to the United States in American history until then. So millions of people were pouring into the United States, and we have to take that as evidence that they believed that their lives would improve if they could get to America. And we have to believe that they agreed with that after they got to America, because what they would do is write letters home telling their cousins and siblings and nieces and nephews, you come too. The biggest advertisement for America was letters home from America. And so the people who worked on building the breakers, they took that job because it was preferable. We have to assume that it was preferable to the other jobs that were available at the time. And it's really important, I think, that we of the present day not impose our present day values back then to try to tell them whether they should be happy or not, because they didn't have the options that we have today. I mean, for example, you mentioned the activities of women. Well, women have many more options today. And so the Vanderbilt women that you mentioned, yeah, they would probably have jobs of their own, and they'd probably be very successful executives in corporations. But those options weren't available. Society had not come to the conclusion that we can't leave, half of the human race behind. We need to take advantage of everybody. So if you judge by the actions of the people in the times, you assume that they are all seeking their own best interests and the interests, this is important, of their families, then we judge, okay, so the people who built the breakers, this was the best job available to them at the time. And sometimes it is said that, well, if the Vanderbilts, if the Astors, if the Morgans, the Rockefellers, if they didn't spend all that money on other things, on building these big houses, they could have spent it on other things. Well, they certainly could have, but it's important to remember that you mentioned, building the breakers. This is a huge construction project, and it employs thousands of people and allows those people to put food on their table and roofs over the heads of their family. And that's the way we have chosen, we Americans collectively have chosen to work our system. And so, yeah, it is tempting to say for the really rich people, boy, if we could take that person's money and distribute it over everybody, then everybody would be better off. But in fact, most of that money does get distributed, not through charity, but because, well, these conspicuously wealthy people consume conspicuously and they spend the money, and the money goes out and it circulates through the economy. So I would say, well, first of all, one of the things we know as historians is that the average standard of living in the United States was growing rapidly during the Gilded Age. So Americans on average in 1900 were much better off materially than they had been in 1865. And that is no small thing. For most people, your material standard of living is your principal measure of how you are doing. Now, it is true that the distribution of income and even especially of wealth was more skewed toward the rich in 1900 than it had been in 1865. So inequality increased. But I would suggest that most people don't wake up in the morning asking themselves, am I more equal than I was yesterday? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They ask themselves, am I better off than I was yesterday? And the average American in 1900 could say, yes, I am better off than I was in 1865, or, just for age and generation. Mm-hmm. And if somebody points out, yeah, but somebody else is more better off than you are, well, quite honestly, that's an argument politicians tend to make, but it's not an argument that really carried much weight with ordinary people. One of the striking things about capitalist development in the United States during this Gilded Age is the essential absence of any class-based political movement. The populist party sort of started down in that direction, but it was much a revolt of farmers against industrialism as it was the working class against the ruling class. There never has been an effective socialist party in the United States. And at a time when socialist parties were emerging in all the other industrial countries. And one of the reasons for this is that Americans believed that opportunity was available to them. There wasn't the caste and class system that there was in Europe. And so a socialist party, a socialist agenda appeals to people only if they believe they're going to be in this working class forever. in America, there was this idea, okay, you come to America as an immigrant, and maybe you take an unskilled job and you help build the breakers or whatever you do, but you're going to get educated, you're going to get skills, you'll move up the ladder, and your kids will get an education. And maybe one day your kids or the kids of them, they'll build a house just like the breakers. And all you have to do is look at people like Andrew Carnegie, who came to the United States at the age of 12 with his family because his father had lost his job due to innovations in the textile industry in Scotland. And Carnegie came from being this essentially penniless immigrant to one of the wealthiest men in America. And people looked at Carnegie and said, if he can do it, I can do it. Now, of course, not everybody could. Carnegie had talents that were not given to everybody, but still that sense of opportunity. This is why Americans really didn't begrudge the wealth of the really wealthy people. In fact, they kind of like, walking through New York and looking at the big houses and going to places like Newport. And no, I'm never going to live in that house, but nonetheless, it's kind of neat to look at.
Is our psyche different today, though?
I would say that a lot of that psyche back then still exists in the United States. But what we hear very often is the lament of, I would say, people of the political classes, people of the intelligentsia, who they wring their hands over this. I don't see among ordinary Americans particular resentment against the wealthy. And opinion writers, they'll say that Jeff Bezos needs to be reined in and Mark Zuckerberg's to blame for all the problems in America and the world today. But ordinary folks still sign on to Facebook and they still buy through Amazon. And so I think one of the reasons that so much has to be made of the irresponsibility of the wealthy is because it doesn't resonate very readily with ordinary folks. I mean, I think it's certainly fair to say that almost everybody who votes Republican rejects the idea that Bezos is too rich or Zuckerberg is too powerful. And it's not even, it's true among some Democrats, but by no means among all Democrats. Because the easiest thing you could do to protest if you wanted to was just sign out of your Facebook account and don't buy anything from Amazon. But people do.
That is interesting. Now, tell me a little bit on the political side of things. Were these titans of industry, these emerging titans of industry, were they active politically? Were they, helping contribute to the campaigns of up and coming Congress people or presidents? Were they on the negative side of all of that political activity? What was going on?
The first thing to keep in mind is that politics was largely an afterthought in the American psyche generally during the Gilded Age. People had had enough of politics in the 1850s, in the 1860s, and the era of Reconstruction, even into the 1870s, because politics was all about trying to deal with the slavery question and to resist Southern secession and compel good behavior upon the South during Reconstruction. And so there was a turning away from politics toward the private sector, toward private lives, toward forgetting about reform. Let's just come home and get fat and happy if we can and raise our kids and try to get ahead in the world. So politics doesn't figure centrally in the events, the historical events, the big line events of the period from 1865 to 1900. This is another one of the reasons that it's hard to remember who those presidents are and what they did. And even more with members of Congress. Yeah, there's some colorful figures. And if you're going to write about the politics of the age, you can find people to write about. But I think that there are times in American history where the focus is on those things that we do together in public life in the political realm. You see this in the Civil War, certainly. That was the big story of that moment. You see it in World War II. Again, there's this common effort. But after the Civil War and after World War II, the 1950s is a time when what happens in politics largely recedes. And the big story is economic development, social development, changes in the way people live. So that was part of the reason. Now, behind the scenes, members of the wealthy class, they did support candidates. They could support candidates as much as they wanted because there were no campaign finance restrictions at all. The Senate during this era became known as the Millionaires Club, and that was back in the days when $1 million was actually money. And so people could get elected simply by funding their own campaigns. Now, you didn't even have to be a millionaire. Theodore Roosevelt got elected to the New York State legislature because he had enough money to finance his own rallies that were held in saloons in New York City. And that's the way you got elected. Leland Stanford, got elected senator because he had enough money, essentially. Well, it's important to note that in those days, senators were chosen by state legislatures and not by a popular vote. So all you had to do is curry favor with enough of the legislators that they would choose you to go off to Washington. So the influence of money was important, but it tended to be a negative influence. The footprint of the federal government in things, even the things dealing with the economy, the banking system, and all that, was very much smaller than it was today. I won't call it a wild west of the economy, but it was, you could call it almost a frontier mentality. A lot of things that are regulated today, nobody had thought to regulate because the kind of activities hadn't even been discovered yet. The speculations on Wall Street and the attempts to seize control of corporations and other things like that. It didn't rise to the level of political visibility. And so the first federal law that was intended to rein in corporations was the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. And that's in 1890, that's toward the end of this. And it was written in a way that made it, in fact, largely toothless until an energetic president who said it's really time to rein in these big corporations took power. And that was Theodore Roosevelt. That was 10 years later. So it's true that there was money involved in politics, but the money didn't show up in positive accomplishments. It really showed up in the sense of just keep government out of our hair. And what the progressives of the early 20th century wanted to do is get government right in the hair of people like that. And so that's when the change would come. And not surprising, one of the things that the progressives did early on was to restrict the role of money. Corporations could no longer underwrite political campaigns. But a good example of politics of the Gilded Age occurred in 1896. William McKinley was the Republican candidate. He was the candidate of business, the candidate of Wall Street. And William Jennings Bryan was the candidate of the Democratic Party and the Populist Party. He was both the big D Democratic candidate, but also the small d Democratic. This is the candidate of the common man. And William Jennings Bryan was a foe of big corporation. He gave a famous speech called the Cross of Gold speech because he stood up before the Democratic nominating convention and he said, "You're going to crucify mankind on a cross of gold." And he put out his arms like this, like he was being crucified. And it just swept the convention. And so Bryan ran on a platform of we got to rein in the corporations. Well, McKinley's advisors, led by Ohio Senator Mark Hanna, went around door to door on Wall Street and basically said, you're going to have to pony up some money or this crazy man is going to become president of the United States and our party is going to be over. And so Hanna basically sort of turned Wall Street upside down and shook it till the money fell out. And there was a rule of thumb. You got to give, I think it was a quarter of a % of your annual earnings or something like this. And the message went out that if McKinley wins, all will be well. But if McKinley loses, then the sky is going to fall. Mm-hmm. So this is fairly late in what is called the Gilded Age, but corporations and wealthy individuals were coming to recognize that there was trouble afoot in Washington, and they tried to stave it off as long as they could.
Well, we have our own senator here at Chateau-sur-Mer, Senator Wetmore, who the same family lived in that house until it became the Preservation Societies. But he was a governor, he was a senator, and he was a millionaire. So I'm sure, these guys were hanging around with each other at dinner time too. So a lot could be done informally to get yourself the candidate selected by your friends in the legislature.
There's certainly that. It was seen as a capstone of a successful business career. You would go into public life. But again, this goes way back in American history. George Washington made all his money and inherited into his money and then went into public life. Benjamin Franklin built a business, his printing and publishing business, and then he retired from that business so he could go into public life. So one can interpret it as they're going to try to protect their wealth and their greed is showing through into politics. But you don't have to see it entirely that way. Some of it is, okay, I have been very fortunate and the system has worked very well for me. Now it's time to give back, because compared to what they made in the private sector, their salaries in Congress or wherever it might be as governor were just, this pocket change. So they were basically doing this out of, well, I mean, not entirely out of the goodness of their hearts. They wanted to, well, I guess what I should say is they wanted to preserve the system that had given them the opportunity to accomplish what they accomplished. Unlike, I mean, this is, I think, important to note that in some other countries, the development of capitalism takes the form of crony capitalism, where people become wealthy because of their connections to politics. In the United States, what usually happened was that people would become wealthy because they delivered something that the market valued. And whether the market was a market for Rockefeller's kerosene or JP Morgan's financial services or whatever it might be, Cyrus McCormick's Reapers and so on. So they made their money sort of, you could call it the honest way. And then they went into politics. So sometimes the capitalists then began doing crony stuff later, but the money didn't come from the fact that they were cronies and they siphoned the money out of government. There were certainly scandals, there's no question about that, but the big fortunes in America were not made by scandalous behavior. It was the comparatively small timers who were involved in the scandals, and people like Cornelius Vanderbilt often found themselves on the wrong side of speculations and got involved with people like Jay Gould, who tried to fleece Vanderbilt and succeeded on occasion.
I don't know how much time we have. I think we might be coming near the end. By the way, I watched Benjamin Franklin, the Ken Burns show, I think 2 nights ago, and it's a fantastic program. And
yeah, it is.
You are quite prominent in it. So you're a colonial era historian as well. But you wrote about in one of your books that the big party that William Vanderbilt had in New York kicked off an orgy of conspicuous construction as the captains of industry converted their profits into assets more tangible and visible. So going back to how and where we started, that's quite a statement, Bill. These are our people, and wow. Well, but that's the story of Marble House, isn't it? It's the story of the breakers.
I agree, and I stand by what I wrote. But my point is not really to point the finger of blame at them, although plenty of people did, and plenty of people say, how could J.P. Morgan build this mansion on Murray Hill in New York City, just blocks away from some of the worst slums? Well, what do you want him to do with his money? I mean, he might better that he spend it than he invested in British bonds or something like that, which he could have, because the way our system works, the way we have chosen the system to work is that some people make a bunch of money, but that money doesn't stay with them. It flows back through the system and it keeps the system growing and provides jobs for lots of people. The worst thing that could have happened would be for William Vanderbilt to say, no, I won't build anything. I'm just gonna, sit on my money and, clip coupons. And that would have cost thousands of people their jobs and would have impoverished many folks. Now, there are other models for organizing political economies, and some countries have chosen a more socialist system. We in the United States have not. There are arguments on both sides of the issue, but the fact is that the American system, the American capitalism, was delivering the goods. And if some people got more of the goods than other people, even the people toward the bottom of the system were improving. It wasn't that the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer. The rich were getting richer. The poor were getting richer too, not as fast as the rich were getting richer, but the poor were doing better and better, which is why, to come back to something I said earlier, this is why the United States was this magnet for immigration, because those folks, it's a big decision. It's a big step to leave the country of one's birth and go somewhere else. And people don't do this lightly. And they don't do it without thinking they have good reason to believe their lives will be better when they get there. And they kept coming. So, when I try to assess what was it like to be alive then? What was it like to be an ordinary person? As I mentioned earlier, ordinary people usually don't keep diaries and they don't write letters. So we don't get it in their words, but if we look at their actions, they kept coming. They kept coming.
Well, this is why we are a country of hope, I think.
I think
maybe
so too.
Driving that is that awful word that people don't like to use. And I love how you talk to your students about capitalism and democracy and capitalism. Yeah. Anyway, did you watch HBO's The Gilded Age?
I didn't. No, sorry.
You will at some point, I'm sure.
Probably. Yeah.
Right. When you have time to watch TV.
Right.
Yeah. Well, listen, we just adore you. Anyone who is interested in American history, you've got to tune in to Bill Brand's, H.W. Brand's on the internet. Any of his lectures, speeches, he's entertaining, he's informative, as you've heard. He certainly puts an interesting light on our history, American history. And I want to thank you very, very much for being with us today. We've got to get you to Newport. Okay. We can't wait for you to visit. We want to show off these houses. There are lots of stories here, I think, that you can tell for us if you get them in your mind. So thank you very much. Okay. And we look forward to seeing you again.
Great to talk to you, Trudy.
Thank you.